Hello, welcome to the Ponderings podcast. I'm your host, Milo, and in this episode, I'm going to be going over James Hillman's 3 styles of denial when it comes to psychopathology. More specifically, the 3 styles that deny psychopathology, and these would be nihilism, transcendence, and nominalism. But before that, I want to talk about why we should pay attention to psychopathology, why James Hillman puts a lot of value into this, how he sees it as a way of why the way we look at psychopathology needs to be revisioned. I'm going to be doing some readings from James Hillman's book, Revisioning Psychology, specifically the second section, which has to do with pathologizing or falling apart. And I'm going to be reading the first couple of pages of that section, a couple of quotes, because this is the section where he talks about those 3 styles of denial, which I think are important to give us a better understanding of his view on psychology and how we should view pathology, what kind of thinking we should avoid when wanting to be with pathology or confront this, making sure that we're not in denial of it. But anyways, so you can find this podcast on any podcast hosting site. I also have this podcast posted on YouTube every week. In this podcast, I usually talk about philosophy, cognitive science, and lately I've been talking about psychology, specifically James Hillman. It's basically whatever author, thinker that I'm currently interested in. I'll most likely be posting episodes where I'm going over some key concepts in their work. That way I can learn and understand their work a lot deeper, and hopefully for whoever's listening, you can learn something as well. But so let's get started here. When he's talking about pathology, he's talking about afflictions, anything that sort of poses as disorder, interruption, change, anything that is uncomfortable in our experience, anything that has to do with decay, with anything that is put into the category of abnormal psychology. And again, for Hillman, he thinks that we shouldn't have this category, or this category shouldn't be seen as separate from psychology as a whole. He thinks that pathology is as necessary as anything that has to do with our experience and life. He doesn't see it as a faulty thing that occurs, or something that needs to be fixed, or something wrong that occurs. He sees pathology as a growing pain, just something a part of life, as inherent to life, as harmony, wholeness, unity, all that. And he wants us to think about this by just recalling on the fact that every person has illusions, depressions, overvalued ideas, rages, anxieties, compulsions, and perversions. And all these things are not unnatural. They're very natural. Limitations, all these things are very natural and rather more normal than what abnormal psychology makes them out to be. And here I'll read a quote to sort of explain this. It's actually very relevant to a lot of people, even though it's not talked about a lot, all these inner experiences. But so on page 56, he says, between the lines of each biography and in the lines of each face, we may read a struggle with alcohol, with suicidal despair, with dreadful anxiety, with lascivious sexual obsessions, cruelties at close quarters, secret hallucinations, or paranoid spiritualisms. The night world in which we dream shows the soul split into antagonisms. Night after night we are fearful, aggressive, guilty, and failed. These are the actualities, the concrete mess of psychological existence, as it is phenomenologically, subjectively, and individually. In this section, the pathologizing or falling apart, he wants to let us know that this is crucial to life. Like, this is necessary. Like, all of life goes through death, decay, and growth involves with death and decay, and we cannot ignore or set aside or suppress these inherent experiences. And by doing that, by suppressing, ignoring, categorizing, they'll only show up more and more. And then also he explains on page 57 how in both Western medicine as well as Western religion, the way we see pathology is very similar. We either label it as sick or we label it as sinful. And the cure for either of these things for our suffering, it calls for either science or faith. But in both of these cases, pathology has the negative implication that it's wrong, that it's sick or sinful, that it's something to be dealt with, fixed, changed. We can't, pathology can't just be as it is. It has to be seen as something that is wrong and that needs to be eliminated. So for Hillman, he wants us to approach pathology differently, and he does this by introducing pathologizing, the term pathologizing, which he defines as the psyche's autonomous ability to create illness, morbidity, disorder, abnormality, and suffering in any aspect of its behavior, and to experience and imagine life through this deformed and afflicted perspective. And he wants us to see pathology as a different perspective from other perspectives that are commonly favored or seen as right, like, ones that are more harmonious, where you're happier or calmer or things like that. He just wants us to see pathology as a different perspective that is just as valid as any other perspective. He wants us to see that pathology is valid, authentic, and necessary for our living experience. And I'm going to read here on page 58. He says, "For to deny or omit pathologizing from the study of the soul denies the soul this area of its phenomenology, refusing this mode of its life, this language of its expression, this means of reflecting itself. A psychology book or a psychological system that does not fully validate psychopathology or lays it to one side as a separate field called abnormal psychology is insufficient, even dangerous. It divides in theory what is not divided in actuality. To treat pathologizing as secondary and extraneous rather than as primary and inherent neglects the reality that pathologizing is not a field but a fundament, a strand in all of our being, woven into every complex." So he, continuously repeats this, where pathology in itself is something that should not be separated from other parts of our experience. It should be seen as something that is inherent in our experience, that is woven into every aspect of our experience. And again, before he goes deeper into pathologizing, he wants us first to recognize the different styles of denial that science and religion has sort of set up in order to avoid or ostracize pathologizing. So the first one we're going to talk about is nominalism. So here he defines it as the nominalistic denial is the focus on words, on the naming and classifying of psychic complaints. Here he talks about how in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was very popular in the emerging psychiatric fields to start specifying, isolating specific disorders, by inventing new names. So creating words to talk about these experiences, these different pathological states like alcoholism, autism, catatonia, claustrophobia, so on and so forth. This was a product of the Enlightenment. The want for rationality, the want to classify the world of plants and animals, the mind, create categories, subclasses, species. And there's nothing wrong with creating categories, giving things names. This helps us understand things, but I think what was, at fault, or what was missed out on, was the fact that these psychiatric names were giving name to something that was a subjective experience. So it was hard to tell how subjective the words were, what value they could give, what were they truly referring to. These labels they encompass the psychological experiences. So to label an experience with one word, it's hard for it to encompass all of the variety, the complexity that is inherent to that experience. And it turns out that this labeling does not take into account the fact that, like, the situated environment of the patient, it doesn't take into account the situated environment of the doctor, of the culture that it's coming from. And the fact that it's not taking into account these different settings. So say if you're using a specific label for one culture, it might not apply to a different culture. He explains here how even back in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was issues with the word hysteria, and how the French culture saw it as one way, and then the Germans saw it in another way. Specifically, Germans saw hysteria as only happening in women because for them it meant something to do with the uterus. But then in French psychiatry, they found hysteria also in men. So these labels, although helpful in creating a name for a specific type of experience, these labels aren't specific enough. And because our cultures and our settings, our environments are so different between each case, between each person, between each doctor and where their practice is situated, it's difficult to have labels to translate perfectly. So when we're having a nominalistic approach, we have to keep in mind this nominalistic denial of these labels that are used in order to categorize psychopathology. They're not going to be accurate. They're going to be omitting a lot of important aspects such as setting, environment, culture, the lived experiences of the doctor, their perspective, the worldview of the doctor, the worldviews of the patient, the worldview of both the doctor and the patient, and the culture they are situated in. Another issue that comes with this nominalistic denial is the fact that sometimes just mastering this technical vocabulary is all it calls for. Being able to diagnose or being able to see the symptoms or the onset in the course is all that is expected. But there is more that has to do with psychopathology. Again, it's taking into consideration the environment, the culture, the setting, the place, the subjectivity of the persons involved, doctor, institutions, and the patient. The second form of denial that Hillman proposes is nihilism. It's going to the other extreme of denying, okay, since these words can't truly encompass these subjective experiences, we should do away with them entirely. We should have an anarchic denial that goes like this. And here he defines it as on page 61, classifications are linguistic conventions deriving their authority wholly from a consensus of experts, from tradition and textbooks. These words become power words, political words, words of a psychiatric priesthood. And he also says here that this denial finds shelter in existentialism. Let us treat the other person as fundamentally, respectfully other in his or her concrete existence. Diagnosis must be done away with. So this nihilistic mindset goes to the other extreme, where one, in the nominalistic mindset, you want to label, you want to categorize, in order to understand, in order to be able to measure these experiences. The nihilist will be like, if there isn't an accurate way to measure, if there will never be an accurate way to measure, we should do away entirely with psychopathology as a category. We should do away with all categories. And James Hillman does not agree that we should do away with all categories. And the reason why he disagrees with this is because nihilism puts the blame on society. Specifically, he poses the example of the Swiss medical historian Erwin Akrenecht. He said that what is sick only in this society and in this period, the normals of one age and culture being the abnormals of another time and place. So he also sees this nihilism as a way to relativize pathology, to say that it has more to do with society and different settings, different spaces and time. But he thinks that this is an issue. The psychopathology, it still remains. It's merely found a new home. Hillman says that we're instead putting psychopathology as having to do with society or something out there, rather than having to do with the individual and their own growing and their own experience. He sees nihilism as a way of projecting blame from man onto society. It's a form of repression in that sense, because you're still not seeing pathology as something that is inherent in man. And of course it's inherent in society, and because society is made up of individuals, of human individuals. But this blame onto society, you're sort of avoiding the fact that pathology is inherent. So even though it wants to do away with the labels and all that, it's going to the other extreme of blaming it on the society, on the age, of seeing the world as pathological only. And the world isn't only pathological. The world is complex, as well as the individual is complex. And pathology is inherent in the individual and in society. And to finish off with nihilism, I'm going to read his quote on page 64. So, before turning to the third style of denial, we must ask ourselves whether these existential, political, and cultural critics have not missed something rather important. Yes, they have seen the misuses of psychopathology, a subject to which we too shall return. And yes, they have given validity to the full freedom, the anarchic freedom of the individual to choose his mode of existence. They point as well to the interdependence of what we do in psychology with what takes place in the social and political world. But does this necessitate abandoning the entire psychopathological enterprise? What else have we for meeting the psyche's pathologizing? For here we must keep a distinction between pathologizing as a universal and necessary characteristic and psychopathology as a mode of grappling with it, a distinction the critics have blurred. They regard the sickness as resulting from the system that deals with it. It is the straitjacket that makes the patient mad. Pathologizing is made by psychopathology. In this subtle, if often noisy way, these critics all deny pathologizing and would get rid of it by getting rid of psychopathology. Their different sorts of attack upon psychiatry are all concealed ways of denying pathologizing itself. So again, it's just trying to place the blame on society, on the setting, on the environment, rather than seeing pathology as something inherent and something that needs to be grappled with. Of course, critiquing psychiatry, science, and religion, these things that have denied psychopathology, it's important to critique, but we need to make sure that our critiques aren't also denying psychopathology as a whole, or not scapegoating our own experience as something that occurs as a result of only the setting, only society, only the environment. So the third way, this third style of denial for James Hillman is transcendence. This third way is characterized by the fact that it wants to stand above psychopathology. So this is actually very favored in contemporary psychology. You can see this in positive psychology, the fact that there's always this emphasis or focus on health, wholeness, a holistic approach, unity, maturity, this upward growth, which these are beautiful things, these are idealistic things, but this notion of growth is very simple. It sort of brushes over or glazes over the fact that growth cannot happen without decay, without catastrophes, the inert stupidity in the world. That the love experience also has its decay, has its catastrophes, has its experiences of possession. The psyche in this sort of transcendental psychology is very naive, if not delusional, because it wants to do away with sin or sickness or suffering, pain. It wants to do away with these things by promoting growth or going above it, getting out of this world of 10,000 things. But evil, suffering, all these things still occur, and Hillman proposes that they should have their place, and they shouldn't be seen as inherently wrong either. He asks, if we're looking at things through a transcendental point of view, well, where is viciousness? Where is failure? Where do all these things fit into it? And they don't. Things like necessity, limitation, ancestry, fundamental lacks or wants, all these things that are fundamental, that are inherent in our experience as humans, they're brushed over or denied or seen as something that we need to stand above. We need to train ourselves to not see them as something not dealt with but grappled with, experienced. It denies the depths of the soul that come about through affliction. And its reason for this is that they see human nature as something, as a consciousness developing organism of increasing information, a positive energy field, something that has a larger wholeness for each personality, and through this larger wholeness, one can integrate the smaller disturbances of its functions. But it's still denying pathology by doing this, because it's wanting to set wholeness, harmony, all these things as something that are above, that should have more space in one's psyche, take up more area. They take up area, but so does suffering, so does pain, so does limitation. All these things take up space, and we need to give them their adequate space. And on page 67, he illustrates this perfectly, that, quote, by turning away from pathologizing, they turn away from its full richness. By going upward towards spiritual betterment, they leave the afflictions, giving them less validity and less reality than spiritual goals. In the name of the higher spirit, the soul is betrayed. So, to conclude here, Hillman wants us to be aware of these styles of denial that we can sort of get into, whether it's through labeling, this sort of detachment from our pathological experience, or whether it's this very extreme affirmation of pathological experience as something that is blamed on society, that is scapegoated, again, as something that we stand above or want to prove that we're better than these pathologies. Hillman thinks that we should be aware of these denials, that they get in the way of pathologizing, and they don't give it the space it deserves in our psyche, in our experience. Because suffering, decay, death, these things will continue to be. The difference is whether we suppress or deny their existence in our experience. But yeah, I hope that this episode helped you understand how pathology is denied. I've definitely gone through these different states of denial for sure. Especially the last one, the Transcendence, because it's so prevalent in contemporary psychology. I think it's important to watch out for when something is too simplistic or too positive, where it's not giving the experiences of afflictions and pathologies the adequate amount of space to be grappled with, because these are very necessary parts of our experience that need to be grappled with, that need to be given space. But yeah, I hope you continue to like these videos on James Hillman. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned.